Hello, my name is Christopher Martinez, and the title of my presentation is Mental Health in the Civil War. For this presentation, I'll be covering mental health in the Civil War. In this slide, in this slide list the groups I'll be focusing on. I'll be discussing how the war affected soldiers on the battlefield, the emotional strain nurses face while caring for the wounded, the challenges doctors face in recognizing psychological trauma, and the impact the war had on civilians at home. Each group experienced the war in different ways, and together they will help show the full picture of how deeply the conflict affected people's mental health. This slide outlines the main points my presentation will cover. First, I'll explain how the Civil War showed the serious mental impact war had on the soldiers, civilians, and medical workers. Then I'll talk about how the war exposed major inequalities in mental health care and pushed doctors and hospitals to modernize their treatment. After that, I'll cover how mental illness started to be seen as a real social and medical issue instead of something people kept private. Finally, I'll discuss how the war led to a major expansion of psychiatric institutions because so many veterans came home with severe emotional struggles. Together, these points create a roadmap to understand how the Civil War changed the future of mental health in America. My thesis, which explains the main argument of my presentation, my thesis is that the Civil War completely changed how Americans understood mental health. It revealed the serious psychological stress that soldiers, civilians, and nurses experienced, and it showed that many people weren't getting the medical health care they needed. Because of this, doctors and hospitals were pushed to create better treatments and pay more attention to emotional trauma. These changes helped shape the early foundation for what we now recognize as conditions like PTSD. Everything in my presentation will connect back to this main idea. This section of my presentation explains how the Civil War exposed serious inequalities in mental health care and pushed the country toward more modern medical practices. During the war, many soldiers, nurses, and civilians suffered emotional and psychological trauma, but not everyone received the same level of care. Black Americans and women were often ignored, dismissed, or treated unfairly, which shows how unequal the, sym- the system was at the time. These inequalities made it clear that the mental health care available during the Civil War was incomplete and biased. As more people started showing symptoms of stress, fear, and exhaustion and anxiety, doctors began paying closer attention to these issues. They studied conditions like nervous exhaustion and soldier's heart, which helped them understand that war could cause serious mental and emotional damage, not just physical injuries. This was an important step because it encouraged the medical field to recognize psychological trauma as a real problem. Hospitals and medical organizations also started trying new treatments and updating their approaches to mental health. Even though their knowledge was limited, they began to see the importance of emotional care. These early efforts helped move American mental health care toward more modern ideas and laid the groundwork for the treatment we use today. In addition, the rising numbers of patients encouraged some doctors to share case studies and research, which helped spread awareness about mental strain. This shift slowly changed public attitudes, making people more willing to talk about emotional suffering rather than hide it. It also pushed communities to see mental health not as a personal weakness but as a serious medical issue needing real support. Overall, these changes mark the beginning of a long, important transformation and how the nation understood and treated mental illness. Here I will explain how the Civil War changed the way Americans thought about mental illness and why that shift was important. Before the war, emotional suffering was usually seen as a private matter that families handled quietly at home. But as the war went on, people started to see huge numbers of soldiers and civilians showing signs of trauma, fear, grief, and long-term emotional stress. This made it impossible to ignore the scale of the suffering showed that mental illness was not an individual weakness. It was a widespread issue affecting the entire country. Doctors also began discussing mental health more openly. They wrote reports, shared cases, and tried to understand why so many people were breaking down emotionally. This was one of the first times American medicine attempted to connect intense stress and war experience with psychological symptoms. Even though they didn't have modern terms like PTSD, they recognized that the mind could be deeply wounded. Communities too started paying attention. Families saw loved ones return home changed, and towns noticed that many people struggled to work or reconnect with normal life. This helped society realize that mental health was not only personal, it was a social concern that required care, understanding, and better medical support. As these struggles became more visible, newspapers, charities, and local leaders also began acknowledging the emotional toll on the war. People who might have once been judged or ignored were not seen as victims of the conflict, not as moral failures. This shift reduced some of the stigma and encouraged more families to seek help. It also pushed the government and medical institutions to consider mental health as part of the public health. In many ways, this growing awareness laid the groundwork for future reforms, creating the foundation for how Americans would think about mental illness long after the war ended. Moving on, I will talk about how the Civil War caused a major expansion of psychiatric institutions in the United States. When the war ended, thousands of soldiers returned home with severe emotional and psychological trauma. Many struggled with symptoms we would today recognize as PTSD, such as nightmares, anxiety, extreme sadness, or an inability to return to normal life. Because of this, hospitals across the country quickly became overwhelmed. Most facilities were designed for smaller numbers of patients, and they were not prepared for the sudden wave of veterans who needed long-term mental health care. As overcrowding got worse, states began building new psychiatric hospitals to handle the growing demand. This expansion wasn't just about space, it showed that the nation was starting to understand that war could cause real mental injuries that require professional care. The increase in mental ill patients also pushed doctors and government leaders to rethink how mental health care should be organized. They realized that treatment needed to be more structured, better funded, and more widely available. Overall, the rapid rise of psychiatric institutions after the Civil War demonstrated how deeply the war affected the mental health of the country and how it forced major changes in medical practices and government responsibility. Many communities saw firsthand that traditional family care or small local hospitals could not meet the needs of traumatized veterans. This encouraged states to develop larger, more specialized facilities focused on mental health. It also influenced early conversations about disability benefits and long-term government support for veterans is in many ways the post-war expansion of psychiatric institutions marked the beginning of national commitment and recognized psychological trauma as a serious medical issue, something that continues to shape mental health policy today. To close, the Civil War showed Americans that mental health needed to be taken seriously. The emotional wounds carried by soldiers, nurses, and civilians revealed major gaps in care and forced the country to rethink how it treated psychological trauma. Thousands of veterans returned home unable to cope with the memories of the battle, often experiencing intense anxiety, nightmares, or deep sadness. Families struggled to understand their loved ones' suffering, and communities witnessed the long-lasting effects of war on mental well-being. This period marked the beginning of more organized psychiatric institutions and a new understanding of conditions we will now link to PTSD. Even though medical knowledge was limited and treatments were often harsh or experimental, the war pushed the nation toward modern mental health care. It also sparked debates about the responsibility of the government and society to provide support for those suffering from invisible wounds. Hospitals began to expand, new asylums were built, and doctors slowly developed more systematic approaches to treatment. Overall, the Civil War reminds us that difficult times can lead to meaningful progress in how we support and care for each other. And it highlights the importance of recognizing and addressing mental health in all aspects of society.